Last week, Jesus shared the first disclosure with his disciples that he was going to Jerusalem and he would be taken in the hands of sinners. He would be condemned and crucified, and on the third day rise from the dead. And he called them to follow him into a new life, into a life not of self-centeredness, but of soul-centeredness, soul-centered living. That's what we talked about last Sunday. And after worship, a couple of people came up to me and said, can you give me a little information about soul-centered living and what that means and what that looks like? And in God's grace, Jesus talks about soul-centered living today as he makes his second disclosure that he's going to be turned over into the hands of sinners, that he is going to suffer and be killed, and on the third day be raised up. And again, the opportunity to live the new life of faith and following him discloses the truth about soul-centered living, not a self-centered quest for greatness, but a soul-centered experience of the presence and the blessing of God. Last week, Jesus was with his disciples in Caesarea Philippi. It's a state park now, or a national park in Israel, Caesarea Philippi, and it is where three springs or three small rivers converge to serve as the source of the Jordan River. So it's north of the Sea of Galilee, and then those rivers run into the Sea of Galilee, and then on into the Jordan River. Caesarea Philippi is also a place where three ancient religions converge. The ancient folk religions of paganism were prevalent up in that region, fertility cults in the midst of the springs and the oasis that rose up there at the base of Mount Hermon. The temples to Caesar were built in that same place, and so Roman imperial religion had an important, significant presence there, and then ancient Israelite religion was present there. It is where the tribe of Dan settled as one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so in the midst of this convergence of three ancient religions, Jesus says to his disciples, if anyone wishes to follow me, they must take up their cross and come after me. For whoever would save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. What can anyone give in exchange for their life or in exchange for their soul? What can you give in exchange for your soul? And so Jesus says, follow me into the future of God. That is his invitation. And leave self-centered living and embrace soul-centered living. Don't give up your soul, embrace your soul, and live into your soul. Live into the future of God. And then he leads them to see the future of God. They leave Caesarea Philippi and they go up a mountain, a high mountain, and Jesus takes with him Peter and James and John, and they're up on the mountain, and Jesus is transfigured. Up on the mountaintop, they see the glory of God. They see the transfiguration glory, the light and the life of God's eternal reality. They see it. They see that future. And after the light fades away, the voice of God speaks and says, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. And then Jesus leads them down the mountain, having shown them that the future looks like the glory of God. The future that Jesus is leading us into is the future of the glory of God. Jesus leads them down the mountain, and there is a sick boy with his father there. And Jesus heals the boy and returns him to the Father. And he helps the disciples see that the future of God isn't only the light and the life of the glory of God in heaven, but it is the experience of hope and help and wholeness here in this world. Healing and wholeness here in this world is an experience of the glory of God. And so they have seen the future. They have seen the glory of God, both the heavenly glory of God and the earthly glory of God, where health and wholeness and healing happen, right here. And then Jesus discloses to them what soul-centered living looks like. They've seen the future. And then he leads them down through the valley toward the Sea of Galilee, into Capernaum, back to their hometown, and into the house. He goes back home. Soul-centered living begins at home. Not on a mountaintop somewhere, not at a religious retreat, not in church, not at the temple. Soul-centered living begins at home. And in order to embrace it, Jesus challenges his disciples, who have been discussing with one another on the way which one was the greatest. Does that discussion about which one of the disciples is the greatest, does that sound like self-centered living or soul-centered living? Yes, it is a self-centered way to live, is to seek and to grasp for greatness in the eyes of the world. And that's what the disciples were discussing. Which one of them was the greatest? And Jesus says it is time to move away from that way of living and to embrace a completely new way of living, a soul-centered way of living. And in order for them to see what that looks like, Jesus takes a child and stands the child up in their midst and says, anyone who receives one child in my name receives me. And when you receive me, you receive not me, but the one who sent me. That soul-centered living begins at home, and it starts with the children. Maybe you have children at home. Maybe you had children at home. And you can remember what that life is like. The craziness of it. The having to go in 4 or 5 different directions all at the same time and try to figure out how you were going to navigate that. And Jesus takes his child and stands the child up in their midst and says, whoever receives one such child in my name. And that word to receive is very important in this context and in the context of what it means to live at the center of your soul. It's the Greek word dekomai, which doesn't show up very often in Mark's gospel. It shows up when the disciples go out and preach the gospel in the communities of Galilee. And Jesus says, if the people don't receive you, shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. It shows up in that conversation, and the only other time it shows up is when Jesus is talking about children. We receive children, we bless children, we praise God for the gift of children. And to receive means to embrace or welcome. It means that. So think of a time in your life when you were in the presence of children and you embraced them or welcomed them. A hug. I remember Diana telling me one of her hardest days was the day she brought one of our boys to elementary school and he didn't want to give her a hug and a kiss when he got out of the car. Because he's too old for that. It's a hard day. But just because they say they're too old for that, does that mean you stop with the hugs and the kisses? No, you embrace them. But it means more than to welcome and embrace and receive. It means to know and understand. And so soul-centered living is about knowing and understanding the children and young people in your home, to know them and understand them. And that's hard. That's about relationship. That's about living relationship. It doesn't mean you give them everything they want. You know, I was at Target a week or so ago, and there was a poor mom and dad with what I suspect was maybe a 2 or 3-year-old in the cart who had grabbed something near the checkout register and insisted that he get it. And Mom and Dad were saying, no, you can't have that. We're going to go to the store, to Safeway later, and you can pick out a fruit or a vegetable, because what makes us grow big and strong? Fruits and vegetables. So they're saying this to him. He wasn't having it. No, he was screaming. He refused to let it go. And in the end, they put their stuff down, picked him up out of the cart, and took him out of the store because he was losing it. And the mom said, "Are you going to lose it right here in the middle of Target?" And apparently the answer was yes. He was going to lose it right there in the checkout line in the middle of Target. And they surrendered and put the whatever treat away and picked him up, and out of the store they went. Jesus doesn't say to give the kids everything they want. Jesus says to embrace them, to know them, and to understand them. But there's an element of embracing, receiving, knowing, and understanding that goes a little deeper. It's to imagine. That's what this word also is connected with, the word to imagine what their life can be, and to imagine the best quality of life and relationship that you can share. So it isn't only seeing what is before you in this moment, it is imagining what the blessing of the future might look like in your life together. And to live that imagined hope and that imagined wholeness, to begin to embrace that and put that into practice. And what does that look like? Well, I suspect in every home that looks a little different. But what it looks like to me as I stand here today is kind of like what I saw on the street about 2 days ago when I was driving to the store. I was driving, it was about 6:30 in the evening, going through town, and there was one of those crosswalks where you push the button and the light blinks so that people could go through the crosswalk and the traffic stops. And I had pulled up the crosswalk, and there was a guy and a group of kids on the corner, and they'd pushed the button and the light was blinking, so I stopped and I could get a good look at them. It's about 6:30 at night. They're crossing the street in front of me, going from a residential area into a park area, an open park setting. And there is a man at the front of this group, 7 or 8 boys with him. They're all wearing capes. And they are all holding lightsabers. And the lightsabers are all illuminated. And he pushed the crosswalk button. It started to blink. The traffic stopped. He hoisted his lightsaber and pointed forward. And he and this group of 7 or 8 boys, who were probably 8 or 9 or 10 years old with their lightsabers in the air, marched behind him across the street and into the park. And I thought, now that is some kind of dad with his cape on, hoisting his lightsaber and leading the boys on a great adventure. And that is embracing the imagination of what life can be in this moment. And sometimes it looks crazy, but sometimes crazy is exactly what is required. And so to live a soul-centered life means to begin by embracing the children in our lives right at home. We don't go away anywhere. To open our souls to God and experience mindfulness and intentionality and openness and listening. You don't go away to a holy place. Your home is a holy place. And the relationships we have with the children and young people in our home is a holy experience. So maybe when you go home, you say, well, there's no kids in my house. I haven't had kids in my house for a long, long time. Do you think that's true? When Jesus lifts up that child in the midst of the disciples, in the home, in Capernaum, he is not only talking about the child in his arms, he is talking about the child alive within each one of those disciples. The child alive within them that they have forgotten all about because they are pursuing the greatness of the world. Jesus is waking them up to see the child present within them right then and there. And when you go home, the child alive in your house is you, along with any other children and young people who are there. The child alive in your house is you, the child to embrace and to understand and to affirm and to imagine what life can be lived out to the glory of God. That's you. And what does that look like? How do we live that out? You know, I had lunch with someone not long ago who told me that we are who we are in this world by the age of 10. That's who we are. By the time you're 10 years old, that's who you are. And I thought, nah, there's no way, that's crazy. And so I went and I researched it, and you know, they were right. Psychologists say that by the time we're 10 years old, that is the age when we are who we are. And why that's such an important age is because we are who we are before self-consciousness breaks in. And the demands of the culture break in, and we begin to make compromises with ourselves about who we are so that we can fit in and be affirmed and have a sense of belonging. And so after 10 years old, self-consciousness and compromise breaks in, and the child that we are, truly, the person that we are truly, becomes buried under the clutter and the demand of the culture. And so psychologists say if you are uncertain about the child that is alive in you, rummage around a little bit and find a photograph of yourself when you're about 10 years old, or a memory from that age in your life so that you can reconnect with the you that you are, unencumbered by the burdens of the culture. Each one of us is a child of God. Each one of us has an imagined future that is lived to the glory of God in a freer, fuller way than we're living right now. And that's true for all of us. We are all called to live ever more fully into the child of God that God created us to be. And so part of that journey is to recognize, where are we stumbling? The disciples are stumbling over the quest for greatness and the quest to be recognized. And in our culture, recognition and greatness are highly valued. And the amount of stress and pressure put on young people in our culture to belong and to be affirmed is tremendous. And that's why it's so important that they know that they belong and they are affirmed and embraced for being just who they are, right at home. What does it look like when we who are all grown up affirm the child of God that is alive in us and embrace it and know it and understand it and imagine the life that we can live to the glory of God and then go and live it? What does that look like? Maybe you know someone who's lived that life and you think, now, I appreciate and admire that person for the life path that they've embraced. They've given up the greatness of this world to embrace a way of living that is soul-centered and feeds their soul and fulfills relationship in their life with acceptance and affirmation. I knew a guy like that. I worked with him for 2 summers. When you hear his name, you'll know that it's a name you never forget once you hear it. His name is Winston Murugh. And Winston Murugh was the camp director at the summer camp where I worked for 2 summers in ministries in the national parks. And he was the director at this beautiful camp, Highlands Camp, right outside of Estes Park, Colorado. And we worked there, and the churches and in Denver and Boulder and the surrounding areas would come up in the summer, and we'd do summer camp. And Winston loved summer camp, except he didn't get to do summer camp. He was the director of the camp, and so he was always getting up and putting on a sport coat and a tie and going off to a church administrative meeting somewhere to talk about the camp and to promote the camp and to raise money for the camp. And I remember once, as he was finishing breakfast and saying something I can't repeat in church about having to put on a tie and go to an administrative church meeting to promote the camp and raise money, he said, I didn't get into this to become an administrator. I got into this because I just wanted to lead kids to experience the reality of God. Well, he was doing great, and the churches loved him. He was a great guy, and he was the camp director for several years before I got there, and then he was there the first summer I was there, camp director the second summer I was there, and then the next summer, you wonder who's going back to camp, who's going to work there. I called up, what's going on at camp? Winston quit. What? Oh yeah, he resigned. He said he's not doing it anymore. And I thought, oh, that's too bad. He's really good at it. I mean, he just fit at the camp. It just made sense. And then years passed, and not long ago I thought, I wonder whatever happened to him. You ever have that experience? I wonder whatever happened to him. I looked him up. He's a camp director at a camp that he started. It was funny. We worked there 2 summers. I worked there 2 summers. I called. They said he quit. I thought we couldn't have been that bad to work with, that it made the guy quit. Well, that isn't why he quit. He quit because he didn't want to be an administrator. He wanted to lead kids to experience the reality of God. And so he quit as a camp director and spent a year gathering up whatever money he could. He got some donations. He got a couple of grants, and he bought a piece of property in the mountains of Colorado, about 2 hours from the Denver airport, and started the Son of God Christian Camp. That was 44 years ago, and he is still going strong. He wrote a blog about the first summer. They went, he and the camp nurse, who are now husband and wife, but he and the camp nurse went to the camp, they lived in tents, and they had a plan for the first summer. And they were going to do an 8-week intensive adventure camp into the mountains with hiking and biking and river rafting. Nobody signed up. And then they were going to do a 2-week hiking camp. 2 kids signed up. So he said that first summer they spent $5,000 on equipment and food and took in $200 from the 2 kids who signed up to go hiking. He said it was not a great business model, but they believed, and they could envision, they could imagine what the place could become. And so they persevered, they stuck with it, and they prayed a lot, and God led them. After that first summer, he contacted a friend of his and said, we need to have some buildings. Kids don't like to sleep in tents every night for 2 weeks. It's a lot. So we need to have buildings, we need to have a shower. And so they came out and they built it. And then every May, since then, so for over 40 years, every May, people come to the camp and they build. And they put up a building. And now there's buildings all over. There's a huge lodge at the camp. The camp looks absolutely amazing. And they built it all because they feel the call of God, and in the heart of one guy who was living a life that was not his to live. He said, I hate this. I don't want to live this life. I don't want to be an administrator of a camp. I want to lead kids to experience the reality of God. And now they have 500 kids every summer. And Winston, who is an older man than I am, still goes on 2-week hiking trips up into the mountains with the kids. because his soul is fed when he leads children and young people to experience the reality of God. He's been doing that now for almost 45 years. That's what soul-centered living looks like. It's about knowing who we are and understanding who we are. Imagining the life that God would have us live and daring to live it. Soul-centered living. Jesus lifted up a child in their midst and said, anyone who welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me. And the child that he was talking about embracing and welcoming and knowing and understanding and imagining what that life could be, that child is you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.